Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Speaker, how are you today?
Good. How about you?
Very well, thanks. Well, thanks for all the work that you do. I know that it's a challenging file, and of course, it's critically important to Albertans and all families, and so it's certainly a heavy burden. I just kind of wanted to go back and kind of follow up on some of the questions that my colleagues from the Wild Rose Party kind of asked, just to kind of clarify some things. And I kind of want to start, specifically with electricity generation, and certainly the goal is to try to, correct me if I'm wrong, the idea is to try to get to the lowest possible emissions from greenhouse gases, correct? And so as we want to transition from coal. Presumably, there seems to be an initiative, correct me if I'm wrong, Minister, that perhaps there may be, the ultimate goal to transition away from natural gas. Would that be fair to say in terms of trying to get to a zero? I mean, I guess it would be the utopia.
I think we've been fairly clear that, in our transition off of coal to renewables, that it'll be 30% renewables by 2030, and we expect the remaining 70% will be natural gas.
Right. But I suppose in terms of kind of the idea of, I want to say ideas and plans versus saying an ideology, because it sounds extreme, but the goal is to reduce emissions as much as possible.
Well, we do know that natural gas burns fairly cleanly, and coal doesn't. So, our first, the transition to 2030 will be off of coal. We're blessed in Alberta, as you know, with a lot of natural gas that is clean burning. So, as I said, our expectation is 30% renewable. And 70% will be natural gas in the foreseeable future. Right,
and so in terms of your business plans, and renewable energy, where are you at in terms of trying to diversify, I guess, renewable energy? And again, going back to a lot of the plans kind of laid out, and the members from my colleagues from the Wild Rose have kind of mentioned this. You have created instances, and certainly, the first person to come out and take a stance on something, oftentimes don't always get it right the first time. Would that be fair to say, not just in this particular instance, but a lot of, there's some risk and there's, some challenges in terms of trying to be the first out of the gate?
With respect to
renewable energy and that sort of thing. And so I guess I just want to clarify for Albertans, when we're coming to renewable energy, we talk about diversification, but we've already had, and again, it would be fair to say that for a long, long time in Alberta, we've had wind resources. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, we certainly do. I think it's around 9% of renewable electricity that we currently have right now.
Right, and I think that the other part too, Minister, it'd be fair to say that our institutions and hospitals, we've had cogeneration, we've had solar panels in a program before your government took office around renewables where people could give back to the grid. That would be a correct statement?
Yeah, and we're looking at, you mentioned, taking a stance. Certainly it has, there has been some work started. We are not the first in, so we've been able to look at other jurisdictions to see what went right, what went wrong, seek advice on that. So we've looked at the paths others have taken, but we want to have made in Alberta solution that works for us, and that's part of, the natural gas probably taking some of the burden of the coal.
And so certainly, I think when you look at the economic viability and you look at when we talk about the ability to get revenue from our resources, from the around royalties, the former government, as you just mentioned, we did have natural gas. We utilized coal because ultimately it was the cheapest. You also mentioned as well that solar and wind during those times before your government took office, and even still, solar is not as cheap as it possibly can be. It's not necessarily economically viable 100% at this point. So, and again, back to my idea of diversification. So the wind farms in southern Alberta have been around for quite a long time. In fact, back to the date, there's places in the province where it's the old structure, right? So from the very infancy of the technology. So again, maybe again, back to kind of the idea that the former government didn't take action on these things. I just wonder if you want to maybe correct your statement. And as your government comes along in recognizing new technologies and understanding that the renewable energy we've talked about sections, so you southern Alberta. You know, what are your conversations with the renewable companies now, particularly when it comes to capacity market? You know, and again, trying to drive to that zero emissions as close as possible as we can get. We've got current wind farms, you know, located where people feel the wind is most viable. But is your department looking at offering under the new capacity market these new renewable companies that said, look, you know, there's some new technology, new science in what we can do and what we understand when it comes to weather patterns, you know, perhaps not always being in the same wind farm, that perhaps we're a little bit off to the side. So the wind may be blowing over here when this is not growing. So it helps diversify. So you're actually looking at that. And again, the conversation around trying to get to this capacity market, is there fairness, you know, rather than going back to the TransAltas and only utilizing them, that some of these other places, again, to help with that black start generation, because the technology, as I understand it, is there. Where is your government in the discussions around that?
Well, first of all, I can say there's been a lot of excitement from renewable groups as well as traditional electricity generators in the direction we're going to. And so I expect there'll be a lot of attraction of new investment. But I'll maybe turn it over for the technical part to David, who's been part of this from the start.
So thanks, Minister. I think there is the ISO's been looking quite closely at the wind regimes in the province, and they've looked at how they can actually bring diversity of wind into the province. So right now, yes, there's a lot of wind in southern Alberta, but there's wind developing in the central east of the province. There's transmission capacity up in the north, sort of the northwest of Edmonton. There's more transmission capacity down into the north, the southeast, or central east as well. So the ISO is trying to make sure that as part of the renewable auction, transmission is considered inside of that, so it would incent people to go to other areas. Some of the solar generators are looking at areas down in the south. Some of them are looking at other areas across the province as well, and those are people who have expressed interest in the renewable program. And so there's a diversity of that's all developing across the province, and the ISO is ensuring that they have the ability to work across the entire system and not just have wind develop in one region within the province. Okay,
thank you. So, and again, just to clarify too, and to be sure, your office and your department, you know, perhaps you know or don't know, there is no initiative where, you know, somebody who might have been a long-time player in the province around wind energy wouldn't get the first crack at a capacity market versus somebody else, that there'll be some fairness, that everybody can
well, I can say
equally.
we will be talking to the legacy, is it legacy, is that the correct term? Generators that, incumbents, yeah. Generators to look at that matter of how we can work with them. So that's in discussion, and again, I don't know, David, if you have anything to add to that part. I think that's where we're at.
Thank you, Minister. So again, you've talked a lot about diversification, in particular the petrochemicals diversification plan. And Minister, I know that you've been out to see the Northwest Upgrader, and of course, would it be fair to say that you agree that the work that they've done out there is exceptional, and you know, it applies in terms of diversifying our market, upgrading right here in the province, or refining right here in the province. It also speaks to carbon capture and storage. Where's your government? Obviously, if you believe in that project, it's a benefit to Albertans, especially under the BRIC program. And when we consider that the amount of jobs out there has applied approximately, when you think about the labor paid, about $3 billion. So that's a lot of taxes, you know, collected, you know, from that job. And you know, so where are you at with the phase 2 of that upgrader? Because I would imagine, particularly in your diversification program, that's probably the biggest win under that program. Wouldn't you agree? Well,
that is a matter, you're correct, I've been out, I think, 3 times to see the refinery. We've been in, had the tours. From what I understand, they're at about the 90% range of that getting completed. So that's pretty exciting. They'll start commissioning it, hopefully, if everything goes well, this fall, and be in production by next year. So we're watching closely how this works as we go forward. We do want to, you know, look at how it's commissioned safely, I guess would be the way to phrase it. We are in talks, I can tell you, with them, but right now we're waiting to see how the first one starts before we look at that. But I've also asked the EDAC committee that I was referring to early to look at the economics, and that hopefully will be part of their report as well.
Very good. And so you say it's at 90% completion, and I'm glad that you're aware of where they're at. And, you know, we've heard from the Conference Board of Canada of this project and, you know, the viability and that the numbers match up and that it is a benefit to Alberta. And then secondly, you know, with those discussions with the company, you know that it is ramping down. That's about 6,000 jobs roughly to date that will be coming offline if phase 2 is not approved, and there is no work in the province at that scope. As you know, would it be fair to say, or would you agree with that? Like 6,000 jobs for one refinery, and no others that I'm aware of to come online at that scope or that scale. Have you talked to those companies about their fear of losing those skilled workers to regions like the United States, particularly under the new government, BC, Saskatchewan, and then not be having the ability to bring them back if phase 2 is actually approved? Again, Minister, have you thought of the, you know, I guess the cost benefits of that, and has there been an analysis of losing that skilled worker to be able to start phase 2? Because again, when that thing is under full production, it's about 8,000 jobs, but there's about 6,000 working there now.
Yeah, yeah, we've been in conversation absolutely with them. I would point to there are 2 petrochemical projects in the last phases before they can start, and a number of the positions they will need are similar to the refinery. So there's an opportunity there for many of those jobs to perhaps go over to those projects as well.
Very good. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because basically it was Pembina and Interpipe that were given the go-ahead from your government. So that was $500 million shared each.
Yeah.
You know, so that's about $250 million per company. And again, so when we think about those projects, I mean, the Northwest Upgrader is at the tune of $8 billion right now, I think, in terms to build that.
Yeah, I believe so.
You know, so $250 million is really not a lot of money. And so I guess to that point, you know, in your discussions, because you've said you've talked to a lot of these groups, between Pembina and Interpipe, have you heard from their executive, at the executive level, that they've actually decided to take the money or the grant that you've given to actually move ahead, considering, you know, the looming federal carbon tax, you know, the increased carbon tax here, and some of the other, you know, some of the uncertainties as your government is trying to forge ahead. Have you talked to them at all in terms of that they're actually going to accept that money and move ahead?
Well, they're continuing with their FID, you know, to move along. They're getting quite close. So yeah, we're in constant conversation with them. They haven't said no yet. They've agreed to continue and pursue. And again, those credits that they're given won't be redeemed until they build. Right. But it's looking good so far.
Yeah, that's great. And Minister, I have to commend you, because I do know that you do get out there and you talk to a lot of people, and you're certainly welcome at those sites. And I know that you went out and you visited a group called Hi-Fi, the pipeline company around, you know, and I'm certain that they were very pleased to see you. And in terms of all that, would it be fair to say that between environment and parks, economic development, that you guys have a cross-ministry cooperation? Would it be fair to say that?
Yeah, it would be. We certainly, as ministers, we talk on a regular basis and work with each other, and you know, we're encouraging collaboration on a number of projects, and there's a lot of crossover. Sometimes it's also with Indigenous relations, you know, depending on what we're doing, but certainly that company was one of the best tours I've done. It's for those of you who haven't gone, it's a great company. You go and see about pipeline safety, and it helps me when I'm out doing my work to talk to people who maybe don't trust the safety of pipelines as much, to tell them these good stories of our Alberta companies that are doing this.
And Minister, you would agree that part of you having to get out there and visit companies like this and visit the pipeline companies is part and parcel kind of the legacy that, you know, the NDP government has come with around, you know, maybe not understanding the industry as well, and then getting on board. And then, you know, now that we have these approvals, I mean, Keystone being one of them, and the Trans Mountain, which are important, right, and Line 3. It's my understanding that in some of these instances, you know, because again, back to the economic development, you mentioned jobs, and you've mentioned quite a few. I mean, to the tune of you know, 26,000 jobs, and I think, you know, somebody listening maybe not paying attention, they would assume that those jobs are underway. it'd be fair to say that those jobs are likely 2-3 years down the road, wouldn't you agree?
No, actually, I wouldn't. Ian Anderson of Trans Mountain expects to break ground this fall.
Okay.
So there will be some jobs, and that will be in Alberta. Right now, there's pipelining jobs up my way, smaller gas lines. So there are pipelining, just smaller gathering lines and that going on. So there is, again, up my way, if people came up, they'd be surprised how much activity is going on up there in the pipelining, as well as natural gas compression stations and that.
Right.
It's a pretty exciting time because of the Montney and the Duvernay, and there's going to be a lot of growth, we predict, in the next while up there. So, it's slowly coming back, but it won't be 2-3 years down the road, it'll be sooner.
Right, so again, just on your business plan, the government has talked quite a bit about and championing, that you've gotten 2 pipelines, but you've just mentioned that, the pipeline work actually in your area has been going on for a lot of years. And so it is important to reference the difference between pipelines, because I think if we want to correct the record straight, there's 250,000 links of pipelines in this province that came well before this government was ever in place. And so again, and here's the thing, Minister, and respectfully, it's around what your government is doing, collaboratively with the other departments and talking about jobs and laying it out for Albertans in terms of the expectation of revenue that we can expect, to support those things like hospitals and frontline workers, that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and that their work was actually being done before. And so at the risk of making announcements without, it's around clarifying. And to support my members and colleagues in the opposition, it's about living above suspicion. And I don't know if you've ever heard that term. It's about making sure that everything is open and transparent. And, and I think when we talk about the coal transition, one of the questions that I have, is really around when you guys made that transition, to change the fate of coal in the province. Would you be willing to table all the documents and all the correspondence between those companies, between your office, work with your partners in economic development and energy and environment, and the Premier's office to table all those documents going back and forth? Because I think what we're hearing, and certainly from the balancing pool, that they've had questions, and I know that other companies have questions, and please don't take me wrong, it's not to call your integrity into question, but we know that those conversations are out there, and I think for your benefit, for our benefit as a committee, and for the benefit of Albertans, to really get down to really where you're going, because I don't think anybody would disagree that trying to get to zero emissions is not a bad challenge, it's not a bad thing to undertake. But ultimately, we need to have some transparency so that companies can make prudent investments in this province and Albertans can understand their fate, whether it's their electricity prices. Would you be willing to table all those documents in Folsom without having to FOIP, without having to do anything, and just put it all on the table, Minister?
Well, first, I'd like to go back to your pipeline comment. Certainly, the pipelines I was speaking of are smaller pipelines. The 2 major ones that we or have been proud to announce are interprovincial. So pipelines are all different. There's different types. With respect to documents, we have been very open and transparent where we can be, but a number of those things you're asking for are commercially sensitive, and we would not be able to provide all of that. But we, as we go forward, we are transparent about the stages we're in. But, with the royalty review, that's one of the things we have vowed to be very much more transparent on, where Albertans' money, their part of the royalties and all that is coming from. But we also have to be sensitive to companies and the commercial sensitivity as well.
For sure. So, Minister, you would be okay if those companies, and you would promise no repercussion if they were to actually give us the documents and we were to table them? You would ensure that there's no repercussion from any part of... from the Premier's office down?
I'd have to look at the FOIP
It wouldn't be FOIP,
rules.
They would just hand me the documents that are,
The
that they
companies
have.
themselves?
The companies themselves, if they were actually to give the documents,
There are
Minister,
confidentiality agreements.
Minister, can you promise from your office there would be no repercussions? And from the Premier's office, there'd be no repercussions if they tabled those documents to us and we gave them to this committee and we gave them to the, in the legislature, tabled them in the legislature. You'd promise that there's no repercussions for whatever those documents said?
Well, I think I'll just speak...
more specifically, perhaps the Premier's office and your office?
Well, I'll speak broadly. A number of the discussions have been under confidentiality agreements. I don't know, David, do you have more to add? Because you've been part of this.
So Minister, just quickly, that's not really living above suspicion, and that's kind of what I was trying to get to in terms of.
But I'm not
Thank you,
clear right now as to what I could and could not share
Thank you,
because
Minister.
of confidentiality agreements.
We'll now move on to member from the third party.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madam Speaker, how are you today? No, I'm Madam Speaker. Well, Madam Minister.
Yeah.
Very good. I wanted to touch again. So I just wanted to clarify. So is the government lending money to the balancing pool?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just where does that money come from?
Yeah, Treasury Board and Finance has the arrangements.
Right. And would you be aware where they collect that from?
Borrow as they need.
Yeah, borrow as they need.
Borrow as they need. So they borrow from the taxpayer, or do they borrow it from a different agency?
No, and
Investors.
yeah, investors, yeah.
Okay.
It's an arrangement with Treasury Board and Finance as to the arrangements.
Okay. So none of it comes from taxpayers, presumably?
No.
And what what kind of investors would they be? Electricity companies?
The investing is AST, Treasury Board and Finance's responsibility, is not us.
Yeah, that's something that's under their ministry, not ours. I don't know who the investors would be.
Right. Yeah, that's unfortunate, Minister, because again, I just think it would be beneficial because the policies you've undertaken, to try to diversify and and try to, again, create this capacity market. It would be, I think, beneficial for Albertans to know, and I think every minister in each one of those departments, should probably know the answer. And I would dare say, would it be fair to say this, or I would dare say, I guess, that if it's coming from investors, those investors are getting money. So if we're saying electricity companies, they're getting it through the ratepayer. And then if they're taking it from the carbon tax, then it's probably coming from taxpayers to fund that liability. And I guess just when we speak of that liability, on page 57 of your fiscal plan, part of the liability is listed as a current year expense. Could you please clarify the distinction there? Does that refer to interest payments on the coal transition?
Sorry, what page are you referring to? Is that's under the business plan?
Sorry, not balancing pool. That's coal transition. Sorry, I kind of threw you for a loop there.
Oh, so
So this
sorry.
is on coal transition on page 57 of your fiscal plan?
Oh, the fiscal plan, okay. Okay, sorry, now I found the page, I forgot what you asked.
Sorry, yeah, so part of the liability is listed as current year expense. Could you clarify the distinction? Does that refer to interest payments?
So it's interest, it's a principal payment. Just think of it like a mortgage. So it's the mortgage outstanding, you pay.
Okay, and does he have that
principal
chart?
and interest. Yes, that's right.
So on that chart, yeah, the numbers, the pay down of liability is the first figure, and then the current year expense is the interest.
Okay. And so how much is the government expecting to pay interest out of the 1.1 billion?
300.
About 300? About 300 million, yeah, about,
Okay,
over 14 years.
over 14 years. Thank you, Minister. Minister, can you also undertake to provide us with the analysis that the community supports will be sufficient to successfully transition the coal communities?
Can you speak to that, or have you, is that under bills? Yeah, I can't give you too much information because that portion is under Minister Billis in Economic Development and Trade.
Okay. So again, kind of back to the diversification. I mean, a lot of these companies have been around in Alberta for a long time. I mean, some of the coal companies that provide energy here have been the ones that have undertaken wind and some of the solar. So, Minister, is your government and your department looking to support such projects as the Brazeau hydro expansion? That can provide a more stable baseload than wind and solar and still reduce carbon emissions?
We're talking to a number of companies about different ideas they have, and certainly as we look to diversify, those are ideas that will be considered. We have my economic development, EDAC, looking at some matters like that, and then that would be part of the coal transition. Yeah. Oh, okay, never mind, that's enough.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
So again, just kind of in terms of that, have you guys looked at other provinces and other jurisdictions in terms of best practices, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and I guess, a cost-benefit analysis between, how much of these projects, help reduce, big industry emissions versus personal use. I think we could look to places in Europe where I think they've done a number of things that, would be able to highlight that. And then the other part too, really close to us, have you ever gone out to take a look at the Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan in terms of how, they're working with carbon capture and storage, to almost bring that, that plant to zero emissions? Yeah,
I've been to several plants, not that one in particular, but, I've spoken before about how innovative our industry is, and there's always, even since I've first been minister, things are developing all the time that are helping these transitions move forward. So this is another example of where we are talking to industry about what are the best ways forward in this transition. And to be clear, we've got till 2030 to do this transition. So there's probably technology that isn't existing now that will be existing, right. And through innovation we will look at a number of things. And you're quite correct when you say we have the benefit of looking what's working in other areas, and we can borrow when it fits Alberta and learn from maybe mistakes that were made in other jurisdictions that we don't want to replicate.
Right. Minister, on page 61 of your business plan, key strategy 3.4 mentions electricity and entities with other jurisdictions. What partnerships or collaborations are being looked at? I know that, I believe it was last year, there was mention that perhaps we would be buying, power, or the idea that we'd buy power from Site C Dam in BC, which is under construction, as I understand it. Can you give us a full detail of what partnerships you're looking at?
Well, I can give you an overarching, certainly with my fellow ministers and with our federal ministers, Alberta is working with its New West partners and the North West Territories and Canada to evaluate and rank the most promising clean electricity infrastructure projects in the Western provinces. So this has been a matter of conversation for a while. These are projects with the potential to assist in the transition to a more sustainable grid. This study is funded by Natural Resources Canada, that's being done. Alberta is also working with British Columbia to explore potential improvements in the existing intertie between our provinces and allow it to operate at full capacity. We have been clear that renewable power created for our goal of 30% renewable power by 2030 will be, however, based in Alberta.
Right. So when you talk about more sustainable grid, what do you mean by that in terms of power being able to be delivered? Because I think Alberta's had a pretty successful track rate with the ability to deliver power, or is that more of a political statement in terms of your objectives politically versus sustainability from actually what it's been providing? Well,
certainly the provinces we're working with are all different political stripes, but it's something we think is important to start to discuss. Perhaps rather than north-south, maybe there's some east-west potentials, but we're in discussion stages. As I said, NRCan is taking the lead on these discussions, so we don't have detail at this point, but it's always good to discuss what could be.
Right. Just one other quick question. Just as a side note, because I'm running out of time before my next set of questions. When you're looking at, I guess, some of the declaration with the UN around Indigenous people, how is your department actually working in that way? Like when you mentioned that, how is your department working with that declaration? Like, how does it fit into your department?
Well, I think, some easy things that come to mind for me is certainly when we talk to our companies about engaging on projects. A lot of our energy people are operating in Indigenous territories. So I think some of our companies do a very good job, some maybe could improve. So I'm looking at, working with the AER and just in general talking to our companies about what are some ways we could do better. Recently I was in,
We'll now move on to the member from the third party, please.
Mr. Chair, Minister. I want to go back and touch on the orphan well issue. We know that the federal government has given $30 million for the orphan well cleanup. Minister, can you give us details on the mechanism of how that money is going to flow?
I can't yet, but I hope to soon. As I mentioned, we're given $30 million from the federal government, and we're looking at how we can best leverage that. We were grateful for that, but we do know, currently, as of March 23rd, we have 1,394 wells that require abandonment. We have 1,088 wells that require suspension. We have 690 sites that require reclamation, 1,766 pipeline segments that require abandonment, and 98 facilities that need attention. So it's a very important issue to us as well as Albertans, and we're looking at how we can best leverage that. We will have details to announce in the next while, but we, at this moment, are looking, talking to groups such as CAP and the OWA and that to see how we can best use that money.
Right. So I guess in your mind, in your strategy, how do you plan to work with other departments and agencies to increase the number of wells being cleaned?
Well, we'll again, work with our industry partners. The AER would have a piece of that, so environment and parks as well, and we'll just look at how we can best leverage that. But at the end of the day, we'll look at the duty to reclaim or polluter pay principle will still be respected. So we're just looking at how we best can leverage that money at the moment.
Right, and so in terms of leveraging that money, I guess what's your philosophy in partnership with private industry to stretch those dollars further?
Well, I think we need to get a holistic plan, and we need to look at a process that's going to protect Albertans with this. We need to look at the environment and keep Alberta still as a competitive place to invest. So we need to look at finding that sweet spot of how we can, administer, the cleanup of some of these wells and the liabilities, but at the same time, work with industry and everyone. So it's we want to do this right. So we want to take the time to leverage that money and do a proper process.
From a high level approach and I guess kind of looking down, have you done a sort of an analysis of how many extra wells this money might help in terms of cleanup and reclamation?
That's in part of what we're doing right now. We know it won't be all of them at once, but it'll be a good chunk towards it. I will note that in addition, this will be in addition to the 30 million that we have this year, and then it's going to go to 45 and then to 60. In looking at upping the amounts so we can start attacking this problem. We're certainly in touch with groups like CAP, who have an orphan well group, and the Orphan Well Association, because to be honest, it's not just a concern for us as government, it's a concern for industry, so we want to work with them and do something, but we don't want to, in this lower price environment, make it hard for industry to continue. So we have to look at what's the right pacing, what's the right amounts, and then, and how do we, get at the worst ones first.
Right. From that perspective, in terms of jobs, do you anticipate how many jobs will be created from this money?
I think it was around 600. I had a number, I don't have it with me right now, but we do know it will be jobs. That's something that perhaps when we do our plan,
And
we'll
from
be
that
able to tell
perspective,
you.
is there a a strategy or again, a kind of a hard line where your department would take a look at to make sure that a lot of this money isn't caught up in, extra administration, that sort of thing, that it's actually boots on the ground and wells being cleaned up?
Yeah, well, that'll be part of, get a process, but absolutely, we need boots on the ground to start tackling this issue. We know it will bring jobs. I know up in my area, I have one of the companies that's in the top 6, I think, in the province, and I know they're anxious to see this cleaned up because that's their business.
Right. Mr. I'd just like to move over to kind of the change in the electricity market and those proposed changes. Can you provide us any details on the changes to OBEG and whether the energy expects and whether energy expects any budgetary impacts because of those changes?
So if that's the market surveillance administrator, and he's doing that on his own.
Yeah.
No connection to our budget.
Yeah, no, there's no connection to our budget. The market surveillance administrator is doing that work.
Okay, and is there any consolidated study on the economic impacts of all the recent proposed changes to the electricity market?
Yeah, I think there's a high-end look at that through the ISO and their website. There's a bunch of information available through them.
Right. Also, in your business plan on page 62, performance measure 3.B talks about maintaining a minimum 7% margin over peak demand. Considering that the current margin sits at 31%, why have you set the target so low?
Would you like to answer that, Dave?
Yeah. That's sort of a standard, I would say a North American standard, to have a minimum requirement of a 7% margin that you need to keep in order to make sure that your system has minimum reliability. The 31% is just the effect that's actually happening in the market today based on supply and demand. So the 7% is required for reliability purposes. Above that is adjusted over time.
Right, and that, again, that reliability number, where has it been traditionally? Like, has it always been up around that 30% mark?
No, we're quite high. We've been somewhere usually between 12 and 18% over the last few years. So it's varied as low. Quite often we haven't been below 12%.
Okay.
The best, as I recall the data, I could be wrong, but for the most part it stays in around the 15% range. And over the last few years it's been growing with the generation that's come on, and then they sort of slip down in the economic demand.
So the current market as it was and as it is today, before the capacity market, essentially is meeting more than the peak demand.
It has been providing enough reliability to meet in the peak demand, yes.
So it's been reliable. Very good. The other thing, one of the identified risks in your business plan points out the need for analysis on the electricity system transition. What analysis is being prepared, and will the minister undertake to release these analysis to all members?
Oh, there we go, thanks. So is there a particular risk you're referring to, or
It did like the
just
transition.
risks in general?
Yeah, so the transition to the system.
Okay, so this risk highlights the complexity of our system, as you'll appreciate. The transition is underway, and it's linked primarily to outcome 3 of Energy's business plan. The potential consequences of this risk could range from one extreme from higher electricity costs to consumers and business, poor system reliability and failure to attract sufficient investment, through to improved environmental outcomes, more investment and reliable electricity at reasonable cost to consumers. The key drivers of this risk include medium to long-term system reliability of Alberta's current electricity system, including the transmission and distribution system, and the level of investment needed in new or replacement generation capacity. Energy certainly is working closely across government and with the ISO Balancing Pool, AUC, the Alberta Utilities Commission, Market Surveillance Administrator, and the UCA Utilities Commission advocate to control these risks. Key measures include designing the
Minister,
capacity market.
I hate to interrupt you. I want to get one more quick
Okay.
question in because I don't think I'll have much time after the
Okay.
fact. So in those risks, has there been a conversation with the Alberta Emergency Management Agency as you transition from where it is now? I mean, certainly they have a business plan of how to protect Albertans in the event of a disaster, but has there been a conversation with the ISO and other regulatory departments, in terms of how that would work and being able to provide energy in the case of a serious emergency like an ice storm?
Yeah, that falls under the purview of the ISO. They work with them. And
Right,
that's
but has
part
there
of
been an
their-
analysis in terms of the risk to your department? Like, I mean, how that flows through your department?
So the risk itself right now, the ISO is looking at reliability. There isn't an assessment on reliability per se at this stage.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you
Thank you,
very much.
Minister.
We'll now move